This is FLOSS Weekly. I'm Doc Searls. This week, Simon Phipps and I talk with Ethan Zuckerman, who knows everything and has done everything about what's happening with Twitter, what the alternatives are, and all kinds of digressions that are huge and really important. And it's great listening, and that comes up next.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is FLOSS Weekly, episode 678, recorded Wednesday, April 27th, 2022, of Musk, Mastodon, and more. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by New Relic. That next 9 p.m. call is just waiting to happen. Get New Relic before it does, and you can get access to the whole New Relic platform and 100 gigabytes of data free per month forever, no credit card required. Sign up at newrelic.com/floss. And by Collide, that's Collide with a K. Get endpoint management that puts the user first. Visit KOLIDE.com/floss to learn more and activate a free 14-day trial. Today, no credit card required. Hello again, everyone, everywhere. I am Doc Searls, and this is FLOSS Weekly. And I may be a bit laggy this morning because I'm on a very thin connection. And I know Simon Phipps is looking better. Are you there, Simon?
Yeah, I'm here. I don't know about looking better, but I have a less latency prone connection, and I've actually got optical fiber from the box in the street. It's a bit of copper in between, but so you never know. I might be able to carry this on, but I don't really have the depth of history you have with the guest. So we need you to stay here, really, Doc.
Yeah, and speaking of depth of history, I am at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, where I think they're using, as Ethan was saying earlier, some of the oldest Wi-Fi in the world, possibly, that's still operative. So if I get laggy or weird, that is the reason. I just want to hurry into the show because Ethan has written and said so many important things. But first, I have to let everybody know that this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by New Relic. If you're a software engineer, you've been there, it's 9 p.m., finally unwinding from work, your phone buzzes with an alert. Something's broken, and your mind's already racing at what could be wrong. Is it the back end or the front end? Is it global? Is it the server? Is it the network? Is it the cloud provider? Do we have a slow running query? Did I introduce a bug in my last deploy? Well, now the whole team is scrambling from tool to tool and messaging person after person to find and fix the issue. According to a New Relic report, only half of all organizations are implementing observability for their networks and systems. The report showed how maintaining network observability continues to be an issue for companies around the world. That won't happen if you get New Relic. New Relic combines 16 different monitoring products that you'd normally buy separately so engineering teams can see across their entire software stack in one place. You'll get application monitoring, that's APM, unified monitoring for your apps and microservices, Kubernetes and Pixie, instant Kubernetes observability with Pixie. Distributed tracing, see all your traces without management headaches so you can find and fix issues fast. Network performance monitoring, stop guessing where performance issues start and ditch data silos for a system-wide correlated view, and so much more. More importantly, you can pinpoint issues down to the line of code so you know exactly why the problem happened and can resolve it quickly. That's why the dev and ops teams at DoorDash, GitHub, Epic Games, and more than 14,000 other companies use New Relic to debug and improve their software. Whether you run a cloud-native startup or a Fortune 500 company, it takes just 5 minutes to set up New Relic in your environment. That next 9 p.m. call is just waiting to happen. Get New Relic before it does. And you can get access to the whole New Relic platform and 100 gigabytes of data free per month forever. No credit card required. Sign up at newrelic.com/floss. That's NEWRELIC.com/floss. newrelic.com/floss. Okay, our guest this morning is Ethan Zuckerman. Ethan is, though a young guy, he's the same age as my kids, um, but he's an old friend and from the last millennium. And currently, he's an associate professor of public policy, information, and communications at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, UMass Amherst, as we say there. He leads a research group there called the Initiative for Digital Public Infrastructure, which is experimenting with new models for social media designed to improve civic life. He's the author of 2 books, the co-founder of Global Voices, citizen media community, a really valuable service, by the way, and worldwide, and of Media Cloud, an open source tool for studying news content online. And he doesn't have it in the thing I'm reading, but also a fabulous podcast. So welcome to the show, Ethan. It's great to see you, man.
Oh, it's great to be here, Doc. Thanks for having me. And
there he is.
Tell your friends at New Relic that it's almost always a busted SQL query, in my experience. I think SQL just stops working at 9
p.m. I was thinking of improvising in there, saying, well, why stop at 9 p.m.? Let's go for 2 a.m., or some other time like that. So there's so many things that are historic and all kinds of importance. And I want to say, by the way, that, you were with Tripod. For the elders among us will remember that you were one of the founders of Tripod, just like an original socially network. Back when Simon, our co-host, was at Sun, and the world was heliocentric, especially when it came out to Silicon Valley. It all revolved around Sun, which is a little ways from here. By the way, I am in the SGI headquarters here. That's what the Computer History Museum is now. So anyway, but you wrote a Twitter thread, which in the past would have been just a blog post, with a bunch of, I think, really original angles on what the implications of Elon Musk taking over Twitter might be. And I'm wondering, before we go into the particulars there, because already Simon and I were arguing about those before you even came on, how would you sum it up? I'll just start with your first line,
Sure.
Which is, at least we know 2 billionaires now control 4 of the major digital public sphere platforms. So have at it and give us the high level, and then we can dig into the particulars.
Let me try maybe a really basic summary of it. I think there are certain functions of the internet that are so important that maybe the best solution to them is not to leave it up to the market. And I actually think having a space where we can converse about politics and civics in the future might be one of those places where we want to look at this very closely and say, do we want to leave this up to whatever's most profitable and ultimately to the whims of whatever billionaire decides to buy something? My sense is that Twitter, along with a couple of other social networks, is the digital public sphere of the present. The digital public sphere is some combination of everyone who's publishing news, everyone who's publishing commentary on blogs and other things, but also this conversation space. And we know that this conversation space gets bent in really weird ways by commercial incentives. We know that there's a strong incentive for any ad-based social network to head towards extremely high emotions, clickbait, things that people are passionate about. That turns out to amplify misinformation. That may turn out to amplify social division. We've already been having this conversation, and now we've sort of turned it up to 11 by saying, well, what if it wasn't just a corporation that we have very little control over? What if we gave these spaces over to eccentric billionaires who seem to make decisions based on what they're passionate about rather than based on what's good for their communities? Maybe this would be a good time to have a conversation about whether there's a better way to do this.
So one of the challenges with that conversation, Ethan, is that, what is that better other way? Because my sense is that democracy is not that other way. Democracy ultimately leads to fascism. And my sense is that small private networks run by people with strong ideas are no better than gigantic networks owned by billionaires. So what would it look like, the alternative?
Yeah. So let me start by talking about the alternative that I'm trying to work with and build, and we can see whether it runs into the fascism problem or the strong ideas problem. I think it's probably more the latter than the former. I think there's two big things wrong with networks like Twitter and Facebook at present. The first thing that's wrong is that they're trying to be all things to all people. It's not completely clear whether Twitter is a space for serious political discussions, whether it's a place for talking crap about each other in ways that's funny, whether it's a space for experimental poetry, whether it's a space for sort of ambient intimacy with the people in your work life. And the answer is it's all of those things. And honestly, those things probably merit different social norms and different rules of the road. It might be helpful to be able to say, we're having this sort of conversation over here right now. Here are the rules of the road for that, and here are the social norms associated with it. So the first thing I'd like to do is be able to have many, many, many more social networks. And we can talk about what's involved with doing that. The second is that I think we made a terrible mistake, and by we, I literally mean like I and my peers, when we started looking at moderation as a task to outsource and try to do as cheaply as possible. Rather than moderation, what we actually are doing is governance, right? We're doing two things. We're determining what is acceptable behavior in a community and how are we going to enforce those standards of acceptable behavior. There are some communities that do this in a way that's much closer to governance. Reddit moderators are in charge of making their rules and enforcing those rules. And in some of the better subreddits, there are actual processes through which moderators consult with their communities on what the rules are going to be. People sometimes go ahead and elect moderators. So I'm trying to get into a world where we have vastly more social networks. Many more of them are controlled by the people who use them, who take on the work of moderation and sort of making those guidelines. And I want to create a software architecture that makes it possible for all these networks to be manageable, which means having control over how you're getting information from all of them. And I want to do a lot of experimentation around what it means for a community to try to govern and run itself online. The good news on that one is that we actually have some great models to work from and to build from, and some of what they found is very promising.
Right. So I don't know where to find the end of the ball of string there, because there's a couple of thoughts strike me. As Doc has been commenting in a discussion on on our internal chat up here, that governance means rules, and one of the things I've said forever is that the gameability of a system is proportional to the number of rules. So the more rules you have, the more gameable it is, and it seems to me that the problem of a rules-based governance, where you look for enforcement, leads to an environment that is not very hospitable to incomers, and so maybe that's where the end of the ball of string is. Everything you've just said is good where there's an intentionality to the conversation.
Yep.
But one of the problems on Twitter is many people enter the conversation without that intentionality to discuss its topic. And consequently, things that involve buying into the sort of strong rules environment that you typically find on Reddit or on Hacker News, where it's less strong rules and more strong opinions, people casually wandering into that environment tend to become roadkill. Somebody moderates them out of existence for a failure to abide by norms. And so it's not obvious to me how you can create that governance that creates a safe space to have a civil conversation.
So interestingly enough, Reddit is one of the places where we're seeing the best experimentation around this. Former PhD student of mine. He's now got a wonderful lab of his own at Cornell, where he's a professor of communication, Nate Matthias. He started working with moderators on Reddit to build tools to let them run their own experiments to try to figure out how do we not crush the newbies, right? So, some of these experiments are on r/science. This is a heavily moderated community, and you have to follow the rules. And the rules are basically that you're not allowed to say anything unless it's backed by peer-reviewed research. So that's a pretty high barrier to entry. And so they tried a bunch of different experiments. Do you welcome in a new user and sort of walk them through what the rules are? Do you make sure that you sort of respond to that first post and try to help them do that thing? I do think we can learn a great deal more about how to moderate well and how to welcome people into our communities. I think the truth is, in many cases, we think very little about governance. We think mostly just in terms of culture, right? Hacker News has a certain culture. You like it or get out. And if we're suddenly going to move to a setting where we have lots of different conversations that have different norms and affordances behind them, we have to onboard people to them. Let me give a very practical real world example. I am an alcoholic, 5 years sober. There are support spaces that people go into to talk about alcoholism. They have really strict rules associated with them. You are not going to take anybody's story and sort of take it out of that space. And that is something that's enforced by norms. No one's going to legally arrest you for doing it. In digital spaces, we can use a combination of technical affordances, norms, moderation rules. We know how to onboard people to these things in the real world. We pull them aside and we sort of say, you should know that this is how the conversation works in here. I'm not actually that worried about it in digital spaces. What I'm much more worried about is this moment of transition. Right now, we have lots of networks that honestly just don't have that many rules. It's really hard to figure out whether you're in a political conversation with one set of rules or a personal conversation with another set of rules. How do we start moving from that reality into a reality where there might be a whole bunch of different rule sets going on at the same time? That's really the problem that I'm wrestling with right now. Hello, Doc.
I have to get off mute because so people know I'm relying on having to carry as much of this as possible because I got such a bad connection. I once sat on a plane, in a plane, not on a plane, next to a college basketball referee, and I asked him about calling fouls and what choices they make in calling fouls, and he said, the important thing is that your job is not to call fouls, it's to keep the game from getting out of control. And I was thinking about how governance and rules work in the vernacular. The rules are formal by nature, but there's a vernacular way that they're understood. And this is not exactly automatable. You kind of need the human beings for this. And I'm reminded of two things with that. One is that the early in the Google automatic car thing, the cars had to learn how to go through stop signs in slow-mo because nobody really stopped for stop signs. The other is, as you and I both know, if at this very moment, people are jaywalking across Mass Ave in Cambridge and in Arlington and in this is Massachusetts Avenue.
It's a national sport in our state. It's an honorable pastime.
Yeah, I mean, the mass holes are not just in cars. They're also wearing all black at midnight and crossing, a 4-lane highly trafficked street. And jaywalking is against the law, and yet people do it anyway, right? And there's an understanding about that. And so I'm wondering about how Jonathan Bennett, another of our co-hosts, says in the back channel, He's reminded of Stack Overflow, where all the best questions are killed by moderators. It's a thought. Actually, he also says this, a crazy thought. Not everyone wants to interact in a social network like Reddit with moderators that work that way. So maybe there's something beneficial about the current system with multiple networks and multiple models. So let me take that to a single simple question. How early do you think it is? And my advanced answer for myself is it's very, very early in whatever this is going to end up being.
So let me do that, and let me also kind of embrace that comment that not everyone wants to interact with these new social networks I'm proposing. I think that's fine. I think it's more than fine. I think that if we try to look at the landscape of social networks and say, I've got a great idea, now everyone's going to move over and work on my system, we know that fails, right? We've watched that again and again and again. We watched Diaspora start up. We watched a first wave of interest in Mastodon in sort of 2017. It turns out that most people don't want to abandon all of their existing social ties when they move on, right? Remember 2016, lots of people I know said, that's it, I'm moving to Canada. Very few of them actually moved to Canada, right? But even the ones who were going to move to Canada, they weren't planning on never talking to anyone in the United States anymore, right? Like they might move themselves, but they were going to maintain those relationships. The people who are looking at Elon Musk buying Twitter and saying, that's it, I'm moving to Mastodon, they aren't just moving to Canada. They're also saying, I'm going to stop talking to everyone in the US. That's dumb. That's not going to happen. That's not how human beings work. We like to keep our relationships. So if we're going to have a serious conversation about the future of governance of these spaces, how we run them, one of the things that we need is an environment that allows us to maintain relationships with multiple different networks. Here's what I want to figure out how to do. I am concerned about Mr. Musk's plans for Twitter. I will find or write something that lets me post both to Twitter and to Mastodon so that I have a place where my words are my own. And I will continue working on a tool that I've been developing since 2017 called Gobo, which lets me look at multiple social networks in the same place. It lets me put together the people I follow on Twitter and on Mastodon and on Reddit. The initial version allowed you to follow Facebook. Facebook didn't like that very much. But I think it is critical that the tools that we build and the practices that we build recognize that existing social networks aren't going anywhere. Let me make another analogy on how early we are, Doc. TV in the 1960s was not necessarily all that exciting in the United States. There were a whole lot of rigged quiz shows, and there were a few sitcoms. And you had this guy, Newt Minow, stand up in 1961 and say, if you look at TV for 24 hours, you will find it's a vast wasteland. And everyone assumed that what Minow was going to do was start taking some of these commercial broadcasters off the air. And what he did instead was say, no, that's fine. You know, continue to put up I Love Lucy, continue to put up Gilligan's Island, but we're going to fund a bunch of research and we're going to create Sesame Street. We're going to create public bodies that let us fund NPR and PBS. This is the moment that I hope we're at. I'm hoping we're at this moment where we sort of go, oh my God, Twitter's controlled by Musk. Zuckerberg controls Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. This would be a really good time to have the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This doesn't mean that I'm talking about a government-run social network. What it does mean is I'm talking about massive investment in tools and communities that can exist alongside these for-profit tools that we have and that we use really heavily, but that we also have some alternatives as well.
All right. So who's going to make that investment then, Ethan?
Well, in the world where I wave my wand and I get to do whatever I want, I'd love to put a nice big tax on surveillance advertising. This is an idea that's actually been brought up by someone much smarter than I am, Paul Romer, who is a Nobel Prize-winning economist. Romer has a set of taxes called Romer taxes, which are basically designed to opt us off of dangerous antisocial behaviors, right? You have an increasing tax like you might have on cigarettes to try to persuade people maybe it's time to quit that. I think a Romer tax on surveillance advertising is a lovely way to go. And what you can do with it is generate a pool of funding that you can then start doing as a form of investment. I understand how unlikely that is in the United States right now. The more likely way this comes about is in the EU. So in the EU, you have a whole bunch of states that actually take public media pretty seriously. And those public media organizations are already finding out that social media as it currently exists is a problem for them. If you are a public broadcaster in the Netherlands, you feel the obligation to use a platform like Twitter or Facebook to engage with your viewers so that they can be engaged in the conversation with you. But all of those tools are inconsistent with your values of supporting privacy, supporting user agency. All of those things are sort of undercut by those tools. One possibility is that maybe you start seeing public broadcasters making significant investment in this space. I'm headed to a conference in Amsterdam in about 3 weeks run by a group called Public Spaces. It was founded by the head of digital for VPRO, which is one of the Dutch public broadcasters. He, along with this remarkable scholar named Josie van Dijk, are exploring a new non-surveillance, non-ad-supported Dutch social network called PubHub. Actually, the way that it's been funded so far is that Josie just won the Erasmus Prize for being basically the smartest person in the Netherlands, and she's donated it for the beginning of the funding of it. But the thought in the long term is maybe this gets funded the same way that public broadcasting gets funded.
I think that could well work, because there's a lot of angst in the European Union at the moment about many things that big tech is doing. I have a degree of anxiety that the people who would apply that tax listen to people who don't have quite such good ideas as you do. Just thinking of the way that the cookie law works, or just thinking of the way that the privacy laws work, which unfortunately tend to favour Facebook and monopolist-controlled mega corporations. Just thinking about what you're saying there, though, do you think that we're talking about creating a network of public interoperable spaces? Do you think we're talking about creating an alternative public-controlled platform in a single place? What do you think the shape of that product of the public investment would look like?
I would greatly prefer the former over the latter. So certainly one possibility for a common standard on all of this is ActivityPub, which is already an open standard that runs Mastodon. What people are beginning to call the Fediverse is certainly one standard for how you do this. But I think part of this is that you actually want significant experimentation in this space. I am not convinced that a social network that includes all of the Netherlands, right, which is what PubHub is trying to create, is viable or desirable. I think we know how to build spaces that can be governed holding a few thousand people. I don't know whether we know how to do millions without replicating some form of representative democracy. So my instinct on that is to say I'd rather do small communities loosely joined, to quote our friend David Weinberger, rather than try to sort of engineer a new cathedral and all of this. All that said, I actually think the big barrier in this, Simon, is imagination, right? When I start talking about this, people's response generally is it's impossible. these companies are so large, they're so powerful, they do so much lobbying, we're so dependent on them. You simply can't imagine a world that works very differently. One of the things that is a benefit from having worked in this space now almost 30 years is that I remember all of these things coming into being. So there was a time before Facebook, there was a time before Twitter. We've also seen some of these communities wither and die. And there's no guarantee that any of these existing platforms are the way that things are going to remain. One real possibility, if Musk sort of holds on to Twitter very tightly and really pushes it in a scary direction, is that he hastens its decline and demise. So I think once you get your head around that, this idea that we don't just have to fix existing social networks, we can start imagining and figuring out ways to build them. I think that gets very interesting very quickly.
Anyway, I just want to let everybody know that this episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Collide. Collide, that's Collide with a K, is a new take on endpoint management that asks the question, how can we get end users more involved? This is in contrast to old school device management tools like MDM, which lock down your employees' devices without considering their needs or even attempting to educate them about the security of their laptop. Collide is built by like-minded security practitioners who in the past saw just how much MDM was disrupting their end users, often frustrating them so bad that they would throw up their hands and just switch to using their personal laptops without telling anybody. In that scenario, everyone loses. Collide, on the other hand, is different. Instead of locking down a device, Collide takes a user-focused approach that communicates security recommendations to your employees directly on Slack. After Collide is set up, device security turns from a black and white state into a dynamic conversation. This conversation starts with the end users installing the endpoint agent on their own through a guided process that happens right inside their first Slack message. From there, Collide regularly sends employees recommendations when their device is in an insecure state. This can range from simple problems like the screen lock not being set correctly to hard to solve and nuanced issues like asking people to secure two-factor backup codes sitting in their downloads folder properly. And because it's talking directly to employees, Collide is educating them about the company's policies and how to best keep their devices secure using real, tangible examples, not theoretical scenarios. Cross-platform endpoint management for Linux, Mac, and Windows devices that puts end users first for teams that Slack. That's Collide. Get endpoint management that puts the user first. Visit collide.com/floss to learn more and activate a free 14-day trial today. No credit card required. Visit KOLIDE.com/floss today. And right now, you can get a goodie bag of Collide swag after signing up for a new trial as their way of saying thank you. So Ethan, in the back channel here, and as well in your Twitter thread, Mastodon comes up as well. We've got Mastodon, and of course, this is an open source show, and Mastodon is favored here. It's one of those solutions. But you have some thoughts about it. I know Simon and the back channel has thoughts about it too. Many of us are on it already in various ways. Even I won't go into it. One of our ex-presidents tried something on it. It's code. It's open. It's free. You could use it. So tell us what your take on Mastodon is as at this moment in time.
Sure. So let me start by saying that if you were going to build a novel social network, you should start with Mastodon. It's really good. It's really full-featured. It's incredibly thoughtful. It's actually very clearly designed by people who've thought very seriously about problems like content moderation. Mastodon gives you a bunch of options that most platforms don't. You can mute people. You can essentially force their post to be behind a cut tag so that, if someone's posting inappropriate imagery, you can essentially blur it out. The most important thing of all of it is that everything in the moderation queue is stored. So there's a reviewable document of, here's what actually happened to you in moderation. The hope is that you have no one, saying, I've been shadow banned. You can literally look at the register and sort of say, here's what's going on. Here are the actions that were taken against you and when. My team is building software based on Mastodon. We have a product that we're trying out in the small university town of Amherst, Mass, for local civic conversations. It's called Small Town. We took Mastodon, we turned off Federation, so this can be a standalone social network. We added in OAuth so that people who already had accounts with Facebook or Google could get accounts very easily and very quickly. And we're using it as the basis for a small social network. So in that sense, Mastodon just flat out works. It's lovely. And if you're going to build your own social network, start by building on top of Mastodon. The second part of Mastodon, which is as a community that serves as an alternative to Twitter, that's not working so well right now. You had sort of people like us, people who listen to shows about free and libre open source software, try out Mastodon in 2017, and a lot of people started up accounts, but they didn't actually get all that much traction because it turned out that many of us interact with people who weren't ready to move to Mastodon, and those abilities to interact beyond the network are not nearly as good as they should be. And, my Mastodon account there shows that I am not functionally on Mastodon. I have posted a couple of posts. I'm going to have to get back to it, but everything there is from years ago. Here's what actually happened with Mastodon. It got adopted by people who did not fit well on other social networks. My favorite example of this is a site, and tragically it is no longer there, so don't bother trying to pull it up, but Switter.at. Switter was a response from an amazing group in Australia called Assembly 4. Assembly 4 is a group of sex workers who are also digital activists and programmers. And when SESTA FOSTA passed in the US and forced sex workers off of Backpage, forced them off of Twitter, these remarkable women decided that it was really important to have a Twitter-like product for sex workers. And so they started up Twitter.at, and they ran it for several years. It was one of the very most successful Mastodon nodes out there. Australia recently changed its rules to sort of go along the lines of SESTA FOSTA, and Twitter had to turn itself off. But it was a great existence proof. This was a system that was used by almost 500,000 people. The trick is it was used by 500,000 people who had a very specific need for it. They were sex workers and their customers, and this was where you went to have those conversations. People claim that they're sick of Facebook, they're sick of Twitter, they're going to get off of it. So far, there isn't a ton of evidence. What seems to happen is when people get deplatformed, including a certain former president I could mention, that's when people actually go to these other platforms. And rather than sort of participating in the full federated Mastodon universe, they seem to just sort of create their own parallel social networks.
So it's very interesting that you say that, because I've been on Mastodon quite a long time, and I've got a.
Yep.
I'm just looking at actually when I last posted, and it was a while back.
Me too.
I found I posted on Mastodon and I didn't get a lot of engagement there.
Yeah.
I found that often I was posting because I was relaying a conversation on Twitter rather than starting one, and you can't relay a conversation to a load of people who can't engage with the context.
That's right.
And that's a significant reason, I think, why Mastodon doesn't work. But I note that the real point of what you're saying there is that you shouldn't confuse the technology with its application. That's right. Mastodon is a fascinating piece of software, but what really matters is that Twitter wants to be the town square for America, and people who want to go to the town square for America go to Twitter. And if you want to go to the town square for sex workers, it's on Mastodon in another place. And if you want to go to the considered conversation about your family's progeny, it's probably in a private group on Facebook.
That's right.
And
That's right.
I think we need to be focusing more on the applications than on the technology. Do you think there's a way we can do that without constantly being sucked back into technology and the legislation to control technology as the conversation point?
So first of all, I want to emphasize your point because I think it's exactly right. There's the technology and then there's the community that's based on it. By the way, for people who heard about Twitter.at and sort of find that actually an interesting or useful service, you should look at Trist.link. This is the new service that the amazing women of Assembly 4 are now working on. But, I'm starting to see many of the most interesting social networks are family chats or sometimes building chats on WhatsApp. These are when everyone in the same building forms a WhatsApp group so that they can talk about the issues of that building and that neighborhood. Is that the way to understand WhatsApp? It's really the way to understand the intersection of a piece of technology and a particular social use. Anytime we're talking about a social network, we're really talking about both the technical affordances and the moderation practices of the platform, and then whatever whatever community is using it and what they're using it for. For me, the way through this is deep interoperability. So this tool that we've been building for some years now as Gobo, the thought behind it is to give you an app on your phone and on your desktop that lets you put all the different social presences you have in the same place. And if you'd like, you could just feed them into one timeline. You could interact with them individually. You could also run them through an algorithmic filter of one fashion or another. You could basically say, I'm having a bad day today. Just give me cute animal pictures, or at least turn them up in my feed. I have a doctoral student right now whose quite literal dissertation project is developing Gobo Doggo. It is our first sort of third-party service that can figure out how to identify those cute animals in your feed and sort of put more in there. But it's trying to be a generic architecture for being able to put those things in the same place. Here's the problem. Twitter historically has been lovely about letting you use third-party clients. Reddit is lovely about letting you use third-party clients. Facebook is not. And they will come out with toothy lawyers if you try to use a third-party client, in part because their client in the mobile phone is this, surveillant masterpiece. It's tracking every keystroke. It wants to know exactly how long you're looking at an image. Once you build a third-party client on that, you're not feeding all of that data back into Facebook's maw. So I think we probably need a legislative framework that allows us the sort of interoperability that I'm talking about. And then I think we can start designing tools. I mean, for the love of God, people, please don't make me in a small academic lab, fix the aggregation problem. I would love to see lots of other people sort of working on this. But I do think if we start building purpose-built social networks, and if we start building tools that let us interact across a large set of social networks, we put quite a bit of the infrastructure into place that might let us imagine and build something radically different.
Right. Now, the challenge with that is, again, how you communicate the purpose of the network when you bring it in.
Yes.
Because, with the... I think back to RSS feed readers back in the good old days before Google killed them. I built my RSS feed list, and I had a kind of a rough idea what was coming in there. But we discovered that when you made that into a general service with the Planet software, you could very rapidly end up with having an aggregation where things were offensive when they came up.
Yeah.
Because the aggregation had been built in a way that didn't look at what the purpose of the aggregation was. It focused on the technology again, but it didn't focus on the purpose. And I wonder how you do that, and I wonder how you also handle the moderation. Because the reason I don't use Mastodon on the whole is because nobody is taking out all the crazy guys for me. And I, I've got a high enough profile, just as you have, that when I show up on Mastodon, I inevitably attract a whole load of crazy people. And on Twitter, I find that really doesn't happen very much. I mean, it happens to a little while, but Twitter is now making them appear not just below the fold, but below the fold that's inside the fold. So that I'm not getting bothered by them. So I think both of those are the key questions. How do you carry the purpose into the aggregation, and how do you make sure that the moderation is applied so that it's a safe space to live?
What Gobo in its first incarnation tried to do was to give you a set of machine learning filters that you could apply and sort of try to get a sense of how would you like the world sort of seen through that lens. So one of the ones that was reasonably easy to implement, because one of my students had already written some code, was a gender detector. So you could make a pretty good guess at whether someone was male, female, or a brand, a bot, or non-binary. So MF and B. And based on that, we introduced a slider. Do you want more female voices in your feed? And we included a mute all men button, which I still think should probably be a feature on all social networks. And it was useful. People played with it, but it was not, really the sort of more subtle settings that you actually want in that. I think what you probably want is a certain amount of noise cancellation. I think you want the ability to sort of identify patterns of people consistently contacting you who you don't want to be hearing from. One thing that Twitter does not do very well for me right now is NFT spam. I don't ever want to see an NFT. I'm never going to buy an NFT. There are no circumstances in which someone contacting me about an NFT drop is an interesting thing to me. So one of the things that Gobo has is you can just say, no, I don't ever want to see that. If you were coming to me with an NFT, it's just not going to happen. But I don't know that I have a big vision answer to either of your questions, either about aggregation or about moderation. On the moderation side, I think moderation is enormously dependent on what the community is, what they're trying to do, what the problems they end up facing are. My hope now is that we can create a space where it's vastly easier to experiment with this. It's so hard if all this experimentation is happening on these platforms that are serving hundreds of millions of people. It's not their fault. If you're going to make a change for 3 billion people, you've got to do it very, very, very carefully. But I think part of what might emerge out of this moment of people sort of saying, how do these social networks work? What do we want them to be for? Might be this ability to experiment both with the aggregators and with the moderation rules.
I'm not 100% sure whether I've got the baton or Doc, so let's pretend I have.
Go for it.
So in amongst those thoughts, it was fascinating that the idea of a mute all men slider, because I want one of those too. But then I realized that mutes me as well. Mm-hmm. And I believe that actually what most people want is a mute all, that thing I don't like slider. And that they haven't thought through very clearly about what it is that they want to mute. And this leads to really the big challenge of popular control and the use of consensus as your guideline for making these policies, is that it turns out that the more the general population is represented, the less progressive the thinking becomes about what the consensus is. And I wonder how you would like to propose to deal with that problem, because that's really the problem on Twitter now. It's become a mass gathering, and it turns out that you get a lot of people who really you don't want to include in the consensus showing up.
So Clegg and others who point out that we end up shaping our own social networks have a point. We tend to follow people who we agree with. This is a sociological tendency called homophily. Birds of a feather flock together. My first book, Rewire, was all about this. One of the interesting things is that social networks don't do much to challenge this right now. You could program Facebook so that, if I only follow progressives, it could throw a couple of Republicans into my feed. It doesn't do that, in part because it thinks that I would recoil and spend less time on the network. You can actually build civic networks that do something along those lines, that actually try to diversify the flow of information that you're getting. And that might actually be a very thoughtful way to go about doing this. So absolutely, we have dangers of putting ourselves in echo chambers. But I would argue that those echo chambers are less filter bubbles, this sort of Eli Pariser style where it's the algorithm's fault. I think they tend to be more of our own fault. And I think if we started building, chambers that were designed to be anechoic, right? They were actually designed to help you encounter some of those different voices. That might actually be a very interesting step forward.
Assuming people actually want that,
Assuming people want that.
I explain to people that the reason I don't watch very many movies on TV is because when I relax, I don't want to watch murder, and most of the movies are about murder. And when I come for my leisure time, I might prefer not to have any of the curveballs from other political perspectives thrown at me. This is all, all the fascinating questions, really. And I think that the conclusion that we came to a lot earlier in the show was that it was about promoting diversity. And I think it was Cory Doctorow that talked about one of the ways to deal with that is not just have interoperability, which tends to break everything. Oh, actually, it doesn't break everything. It reduces everything down to the lowest common denominator. Yep. But rather have adversarial interoperability.
That's exactly right.
People who disagree with the controlling platform have got the freedom to go hook into it in the way that they choose rather than the way they're allowed. Do you want to talk some more about? I think you believe in that as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about
absolutely.
that?
And Corey and I actually talk about this quite a bit because it's a common interest between our work. So, again, if I get to do what I'm sort of hoping to do with all of these things, it is not as simple as just saying, okay, everything's interoperable. You need the ability to say, I want to be able to read Facebook in my third-party reader. I want to be able to post to Facebook in my third-party reader. Because only then do you have this sort of chance of building something that can operate between your small social network and Facebook. Facebook's not going to open its doors up to you. The analogy that Corey often comes down to, and that I found myself literally doing some research on, is the early days of instant messaging. If you remember back then, AOL had an instant messenger, Microsoft Network had an instant messenger, Yahoo had an instant messenger, and it was just miserable. You were trying to figure out how to communicate with all of these people. They were all on their own platforms, and you needed to keep 5 or 6 of these different windows open. And then finally, ICQ said, you know what, we're just going to interoperate with everybody, whether they like it or not. People actually wrote code designed to crash each other's clients, right? They would write hostile code saying, oh, you're trying to read MSN messages and you're on AOL. We're going to try to crash your client. And then everyone just sort of realized at a certain point that their users hated them and that they really wanted a tool that could interoperate. And, now that, of course, has turned into an open standard for messaging that's pretty, near universally supported. So for me, that's one of those interesting examples of how adversarial interoperability might get you to the point where you sort of rationalize a problem and make it actually work for the user. where you previously couldn't have worked it out. The trick, as I think Corey would tell you, is that the stuff that we used to be able to get away with in the 1990s is just much harder to do now. And the lawyers are nastier and toothier, and the lawsuits come earlier and faster. And, we need to find a way to bring adversarial interoperability back into the space.
This is great. And I hate to say we're down to the end,
of course,
and to the short rows at the end of the show. So we have some sort of standard questions that come up at the end. The first, if you can answer it briefly, is there any topic we haven't touched on that you'd like to address before we close?
No, I mean the topics are not brief. They're topics like what do we think Elon Musk will do, and does he have the capacity to CEO 5 businesses simultaneously? I think we'll have to leave that for another conversation.
Yeah, It'll be what it is, and whatever it is, as you said in your own.
I do have one critical question. It's for Simon, which is, what is the scarf hanging on his wall? I've looked it up. It's not Liverpool, and it's not Southampton.
So this is a FLOSS United scarf.
This is FLOSS United. This would explain why I had such a tough time on my various databases of. Okay.
The history of this scarf is that I was the president of the Open Source Initiative for nearly 10 years, and we had a joint project between OSI, Software Freedom Conservancy, and the Free Software Foundation, and we decided we would make a garment that supporters of all three organizations could wear to show united support for the principle of software freedom. So this is the scarf.
I am very glad I asked that. It's Liverpool colors, which was really throwing me off because it's not the Liverpool crest. And I was trying to figure it out. I actually took a screenshot and then blew it up, and I was able to read United, but I wasn't able to read FLOSS. So I'm glad I asked that.
Yeah, they're kind of rare, actually, because it turns out there isn't a lot of unity between those three organizations. But anyway,
it's a handsome scarf, and I'm glad it's in a point of pride in your studio.
Thank you.
That's fabulous. I hate that the show has to come to a close at this point. So there's two easy to answer questions that we always close with. One is, what is your favorite text editor and scripting language?
So,
which I'm guessing you have some favorites.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna piss people off, but I'll answer honestly. I write everything in BB Edit. I'm a Mac user. It is by far the text editor that makes my life the easiest. It's interesting. My son is 12 years old, so this question of what your first scripting language is coming up. I'm a Perl guy, but I'm teaching him Python, and I just think that's the responsible thing to be doing as a parent in 2022. He's asked about Perl. We've had those conversations. Someone will offer you Perl at some point in the future. Maybe what you want to make the decision is to just say no and use Python. I've told him that anything he decides to program is okay with me, but if he programs in Visual Basic, he's dead to me.
That is great. I think I'm thinking about my grandson, who's now 14, is programming in something, but I don't want to say what it is because I'll have it wrong because I don't remember exactly, but I'm sure it's not Visual Basic though. So this is good. Ethan, this has been fabulous. It's just not enough time. And
it's been really fun.
We'll have you back before your beard is.
Yeah, we need to finish that conversation about instant messengers, actually, because I was the co-author of a paper for Internet Society on interoperability, and my observation was that interoperability is a very dangerous topic, and I've had this conversation with Corey as well, in that it quickly provides an anti-competitive weapon that allows incumbents to suppress market entry. And that is really not getting enough airtime in the conversations. I think you're completely correct about interoperability, but that dimension is not getting enough airplay. And unfortunately, that barrier to entry thing is the big problem with all of the EU's actions, is that they're being taken naively and they're creating barriers to diversity, not stimuli to it. So I would love to finish that conversation one day.
Absolutely. I would love it if you would forward the paper to me and I can prep for that next conversation as well. Terrific.
Well, this is
all right.
This is
Thank
great.
you, gents. I really appreciate it. And
and hang around. We'll as soon as possible. It's great. So Simon, how was that for you, man? That was good.
It was, profoundly frustrating, Doc, because those are all the beginnings of 6-hour conversations that would normally involve an entire bottle of rum. And I didn't have any rum, and we didn't finish any of the conversations. But otherwise,
I know. I'm glad that Ethan got homophily in there, because I learned about homophily from Ethan while he was writing Rewire, and it started with my pretending I knew what he was talking about, and it just ended up with me just getting schooled on it. But it's behind everything. It's how we're social. We tend to hang out with people we know, and of our own kind, whatever kind is.
I'm sure that Twitter
last night with.
I'm sure Twitter has the Tweety Bird because it's about birds of a feather,
Yeah. So because we have to hasten here, I'm going to jump ahead and say we have coming up next week is Amit Taylor of True Up. So there's that. And any last plugs or thoughts there, Simon, before we move on?
Not particularly. I'd love for everybody to follow me on Twitter. It would be great to find some people to hang out with on Mastodon as we're all moving there. And it's the same ID on Mastodon, but I'm on mastodon.cc if you want to follow me. And it would be great to have thousands of people go to my Patreon and chip in, but I don't think that's going to happen. So, I think I just have to let it rest and enjoy the conversation we just had. Thanks, Doc.
I fear that I am a Mastodon. I actually had a Mastodon at some point. I don't even know where it was. It's been too long. So thank you, everybody. This has been a great show. We will, So we will see you next week. Thanks a lot. FLOSS Weekly here.
Did you spend a lot of money on your brand new smartphone and then you look at the pictures on Facebook and Instagram and you're like, what in the world happened to that photo? Yes, you have. I know. It happens to all of us. Well, you need to check out my show, Hands On Photography, where I'm going to walk you through simple tips and tricks that are going to help make you get the most out of your smartphone camera or your DSLR or mirrorless, whatever you have. And those shots are going to look so much better. I promise you. So make sure you're tuning in to twit.tv/hop for Hands On Photography to find out more.